Welcome to the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center 2021 Spring ADRC Meeting. Today's imaging core session will be from 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time, as I pass it off to Beth Mormino, who is our first speaker of the day. Beth is the imaging core leader at Stanford ADRC, and Beth, it's all you.
Thanks. All right. Okay, so welcome everybody to the imaging core session. I just have a brief intro before we turn it over to NIA. So I'm Beth Mormino. I lead the imaging core at Stanford. I'll be moderating this session with Sterling Johnson, who leads the biomarker core at Wisconsin. We're both co-chairs of the imaging core steering committee. And I'd like to acknowledge the other 5 members of the committee: Emily, Charlie, John, Kajal, and Konstantinos. We meet once a month and discuss these concepts that we'll be talking about today, and are really looking to hear your guys' feedback. So just a brief overview of what we're planning today. So the first section is really dedicated to what we're calling forward-thinking plans, which is motivated by the transitions that we've been going through with imaging, the feedback that we've obtained through the interview surveys that we've done with some of the sites, and also the discussions with the committee. We've dedicated a fair amount of time for discussion. So, during this time, in general, feel free to use the question and answer section, but we would really appreciate, comments, especially from the site directors and the leaders of both imaging and biomarkers, and also the clinical cores, to give us feedback on all the concepts that we're going to be covering in this first session. We're then going to get to hear about some of the recent funded supplements from Annie Cohen and Brian Gold, and then we'll end on an update from the SCAN team. So as we begin the session, I think we should, think specifically about, what we think imaging is going to teach us about Alzheimer's disease and related disorders over the next decade. So I think this is a really exciting time in the field and in this program in particular, and I think we should be thinking about this in a forward-looking manner. I think we want to consider, how specifically will the ADRC program in particular contribute to this effort? How will recent infrastructure programs like SCAN contribute? And also what additional resources are needed, for our imaging goals in this program? I also want to acknowledge, we've seen a number of transitions recently within imaging in the ADRC program, and this has happened on multiple levels. So at the site level, now all individual sites have a biomarker core. This oftentimes includes imaging. Sometimes imaging is separate. We also have this steering committee that I introduced at the beginning. This was elected by the, by folks in the ADRC. And we're supposed to reflect the needs and interests of the individual sites. At the resource level, we've seen recent transitions with new infrastructure placed in the SCAN program, which is really geared towards prospective harmonized imaging related to amyloid, tau, and neurodegeneration imaging modalities, which are considered key phenotypes for AD-RD. And this sort of effort, joins other efforts across different cores with harmonization efforts, really enabling the linking of these important data types in this program. And finally, last year, there was also a funding opportunity related to this effort. So there were supplement funds that were given to a few sites, to a portion of sites. And the idea here was that these funds, were providing additional funding, for harmonized ATN efforts. And then to step back, so those are the local transitions, but I also think we need to consider, the kind of big picture of the program. And there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of parts that need to synergistically, work together. So there's obviously the individual sites. There's 35 individual ADRC sites that all really excel at their own innovative capacities, in addition to, to having a common interest in ATN-like modalities. There's the funding level is so critical to imaging, and funding is kind of complicated. It goes through both the NIH and NIA, but also other funding mechanisms, non-sponsored funds, for instance. The NIA has come up with different strategies for funding our work. Sometimes it's directly to a site via R01s and core budgets. Sometimes it's through collaborative efforts like USE that pull together a couple sites. And then sometimes it's directly through infrastructure grants like SCAN to help, provide resources, for our work. And then in terms of resources, these are really critical for these large scale efforts. For SCAN, we're going to talk a lot about that today. That really is to help promote, data harmonization and dissemination. The results and the work from this will go back to individual sites, and will also, go back to the larger scientific community. And finally, another source of resources we're going to touch on is our pet companies. So this has, these different pet companies are intimately linked to access to different ligands, and these many collaborative efforts have already taken place, across different sites. And I think we should really consider, these relationships with these companies, critical resources for AT imaging, and we should try to better understand how to take advantage of that as a program. And then this is my last slide. For the intro, I do think the potential of the ADRC program related to imaging is extremely exciting, and it's really a time of opportunity. So here's just a simple table showing some projections to highlight kind of the big data kind of concept, from the ADRC program. So if we consider, two modalities, amyloid PET and tau PET, and we compare projections to ADNI, which is clearly a very successful multi-site study, we can see that over the course of ADNI, there's a little over 3,000 amyloid PET scans that have been collected, and a little over 1,000, tau PET scans that have been collected. But based on our survey data of the ADRC sites, if the actual program was funded to full capacity, based on what the sites could actually do in terms of these same modalities, after 2 years, there would be over 4,000 amyloid PET scans, over 3,700 tau PET scans. And after 5 years, we'd have over 10,000 amyloid scans and nearly as many tau PET scans. So it's really very dramatic, the potential capacity for this sort of program. In addition to the overall scope, I mean, there's these clear, unique aspects of the ADRC program that I think make it quite distinct from things like ADNI and very exciting. So I already mentioned, we have this local innovation that's happening in parallel to ATN like efforts. There's heterogeneity in clinical diagnosis. So we have representation beyond just normal controls, MCI and AD. There's also more diversity in demographics, both with respect to the age range and also race and ethnicity. And there's this great opportunity for linking with affiliated data, which is quite extensive and very important data, such as the postmortem piece. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to hand it over to NIA for their updates.
Good morning, everyone. I am Cerise. Imaging gets to be in my purview. I want to just thank Beth for the summary that she just provided of the goals and the opportunities that throughout the last year, the committee has gathered to highlight for you and summarize for you. We wanted to point out that the Imaging Steering Committee and all of the steering committees across the cores are your central contact to plan and coordinate the research and the science that we need across the center network. We think that, working together in a coordinated manner to maximize data, resources, and to understand the needs and the uses of the data and the resources that you may need in the future are, need to happen all together, and they need to have a coordinated planning and having all of the data available of the goals and the opportunities that you see the centers playing a role in neuroimaging is really, really important. And I think as a goal in the future, we would want more feedback from other centers. I know that Sterling and Beth, as the co-chairs of the Imaging Steering Committee, have worked really hard at having one-on-one meetings with everyone. I know that's a lot of time and that's a lot of effort, and I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with Beth and Sterling, and for Beth and Sterling for taking that time in there. Also, we need some multiple touch points other than just May of every year to take these ideas that will be shared in today's meeting and kind of run with them in the year of 2021. So I want to thank again the steering committee for all their efforts in kind of shooting ideas across and presenting to you today all of these concepts, and that we can make a great plan for opportunities in the future. So thanks.
Cerise, can I ask a quick question?
Yes, Brian.
Hey, Cerise, how's it going? So thanks for that. That was super helpful. I'm wondering what you're thinking in terms of ongoing funding after the year is up. So are we thinking about, is there going to be a second scan call for centers? Is there going to be a no-cost extension? What are you thinking right now in terms of how that's going to work?
Well, I think, we need more collaborative idea and a process as we move forward as a network to define what the resources that we need. So if we can all collaborate and define what resources we need, we could all kind of work together to, make that happen.
Right. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, so as Cerise mentioned, we did have the opportunity to speak with you guys one-on-one. So we haven't done this for all the sites yet. We've covered about 20 sites. So for the sites we haven't done the interview yet, we're going to be doing the second batch, hopefully this next month and a half or so. So you'll be hearing from us. There have been a lot of transitions in the last year in general. And we had a couple ideas about this survey, but one kind of basic idea was to kind of tackle the issue related to PET barriers. So we were gearing this towards understanding the site's, current flow and specific barriers to PET imaging. We were able to get input from about 20 sites, the 13 sites outside the committee and the 7 sites that are reflected on the steering committee. We started off with what I think was kind of a naive approach. So first we just emailed a survey with 8 questions, and I kind of thought of it as we would collect these numbers and make some projections, but it became pretty clear that there's a lot more to what is actually going on at the sites than what is reflected in a high level number. So we decided then to email the survey, but then to set up a 30-minute interview to kind of go over the survey. And it really ended up being just a conversation starter, the survey itself. Like all the conversations were very site specific. And so the data I'm going to be presenting is more of a qualitative kind of view and interpretation of the survey rather than some hard numbers. Also the interviews, amongst other transitions, it did coincide with the scan launch. So the ability to actually upload data into scan. So we were able to also talk to sites about that. So just to make this clear, the results, are quite qualitative, but we were, I think, able to capture some distinct aspects related to the individual sites, and there definitely were common themes that were expressed, across the sites as well. So a couple of general impressions. So, this might be obvious for everybody here, but I think it's good to verbalize, COVID has had a huge impact on imaging in the ADRC program. It has really slowed down, our data collection and has added a lot of stress and burden to, our centers in general as we've dealt with this situation. So that's something we've all shared this year. And I think we all know that this is an outlier year, and what happened this year is not what we anticipate in the future. But it really has been about a year of very limited scanning, since the pandemic started. Many sites have started collecting some data, at some point in the middle. But I think, fortunately, I think most of us are, kind of realizing that things are going to be able to get back to normal-ish, for these research procedures. So it's been a very difficult year for imaging, but I think, we are at an exciting, hopefully, turning point where we're actually going to start being able to, do what we do best. Two other general impressions that were clear from the interview is that, there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity across sites on so many different levels. So obviously there's different scientific focus and expertise. There's also the maturity differs quite a bit. So as some sites are decades old and some are brand new, and that, comes with, different structures. The funding model, so Sterling's going to talk about this in his talk, but also how funding and imaging works is very different across sites. And this is, largely because imaging has been kind of introduced at different phases. And also the role of ADRC, the ADRC itself in imaging is also differs across sites. Sometimes the ADRC is very central to this, but then sometimes it's actually very peripheral and it kind of collaborates with the imagers at that site. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the structure of these ADRCs. And then another general impression is that with respect to PET, the capabilities are clearly present, across the majority of sites. So many sites are doing amyloid and tau PET imaging, in their center on clinical core participants. And even those that are not doing it, they are doing it in the context of other studies. There's so many clinical trials and multi-site studies that use PET imaging. So a lot of the logistics of sorting this out, is present within these sites, even if they're not scanning all their clinical core participants. So I think this really is exciting with thinking about expanding this capacity, given that so much work has already been done, on the PET side to make this possible. So another thing is, we were able to talk about the transition to SCAN. So as you guys know, SCAN is this new infrastructure program that's going to be accepting prospective compliant heart imaging that captures A, T, and N. This is a recent transition. So this is January onward. SCAN is going to be accepting this data. Before, data was being shared through the ADRC program, but it was a different system. It was going through NACC. Kind of going forward, there's a different upload process through LONI and NACC. And eventually the data will be able to be downloaded. Previously, this was through NACC, and in the future, it will still be through NACC in connection with LONI. And this will involve both these harmonized image data and also CSV files that have processed data that investigators can use. So there were definitely a number of questions about just SCAN and the flow that came up during the interviews. Here I'm circling kind of the main kind of questions. So one was, what is going to happen to all this retrospective data? So broadly, retrospective data is beyond the scope of SCAN. SCAN is really focused on kind of the prospective harmonized component. But this data, I think the idea is that, additional funding, might be possible to be able to work with this data and integrate it into SCAN. There's also the question of, what will happen to non-compliant data going forward. And I think the idea right now is that this data will be captured if it is uploaded and just kind of set aside for now. There's also questions about what counts as being compliant. And this is, I think, is a little more complicated on the MRI side. Within the MRI side, there's kind of these two tiers of what counts as compliant. One is this minimal data set of the ADNI, T1, and FLAIR. And then there's also an additional tier that involves the additional ADNI sequences. And then there were a lot of questions about uploading the data, but I think, this is largely because uploading just was launched very recently in April or so. So I think just, sites haven't really had the opportunity to really test this out. And also, with the slow data collection because of COVID. Okay, so now I'm going to spend the next couple slides, kind of discussing the barriers that we identified to PET imaging. And so before kind of talking about the barriers, it is important to acknowledge that there's multiple components, that are needed, that need to align just right for a PET scan to be successful. You can't simply just purchase, a ligand and then you'll get a PET scan. And I think we all are aware of this, but it is important for kind of thinking about the resources that are needed. So as we all know, there's a fair amount of coordination that needs to happen up front and reporting of the individual subjects. There's the access or the production of the ligand itself. There's, having a scanner, having access to a scanner to actually collect the data. And then there's the data itself. Somebody has to, get that data, process that data, monitor that data. So there's a number of things, that we're doing in our imaging and biomarker cores, to make these scans successful. So one barrier that was identified, is simply a question of just funding. So many sites, have these capabilities in place. They've connected with companies or they produce their own ligands. They have access to research scanners, and really are just limited by the very high cost of PET scanning. About 50% of sites, communicated that if they just had a bigger budget, they would probably be able to scan about 50 more sites per year. So this, in my view, is probably the easiest problem to solve. Everything is set up, and it's just a matter of getting these resources to those sites. The next barrier is that, there is limitations with scanner availability. Some sites use research scanners, some use clinical scanners, and they all have their different sets of limitations. And there's also the issue of ligand delivery. So if you're working with a company, a particular ligand, sometimes the delivery is restricted to certain days of the week, and also certain hours, within those days. So even if the scanner is available, it may not, be available at those exact times. So that definitely is a barrier that we're dealing with. There's also, barriers with the ligands themselves. Oftentimes this depends on company interactions. This can, come with it a lack of efficiency. It can be very time consuming, and also can be kind of, dictated by the interests of the company sometimes as well. So this potentially, is a potential barrier for us. There's also, especially for sites that are newer to PET imaging, there are these regulatory aspects that have to be addressed with PET scanning, like INDs and things like that. And that could be a barrier, especially going through this kind of for a center going through this for the first time. And then I think this is my last point from the survey. So we did ask, whether or not, more resources would be helpful, and, pretty much all sites said yes, more resources would be very, very helpful, and we could use that in a very productive way for different aspects of imaging. So as I mentioned, some sites would just, use this to scan more unique clinical core participants if they have more resources. Some sites, communicated that they would be able to enrich their ADRC with additional subjects, if their current clinical core participants were already saturated with imaging. Some sites, indicated that, the current models now is they're oftentimes using non-sponsored funds to pay for things like A&T imaging. And if they had resources, this would allow them to use those funds for more innovative purposes, like novel PET tracers, more on the MRI side. So that would be a really nice, shift to use these more flexible funds for more kind of high risk science. Some said, as they would scale up, or maybe even now, there is a need for more, supporting staff to actually, conduct these studies. It also has been mentioned too that if there were these additional resources to support this work, it would potentially allow more sites to participate in collaborative efforts. So oftentimes these collaborative efforts, they do come with additional burden on the staff at the center. To summarize, from the survey, it's very clear there's a lot of ATN imaging that's taking place. There's a lot of capabilities in this realm, in addition to the local innovation that is ongoing at the sites. The scan transition, it's very recent, and participation is just beginning. And this is also complicated by the fact that data collection has been so low due to COVID. I guess I would say that in general, the sites are not at their full capacity for ATN imaging. which represents, I think, a key opportunity for us as a program. I think there are these opportunities for scanning, and many of the work is in place to do this. I think there is a need to address these barriers, and some of these barriers are just addressed with additional resources. I think some of these barriers might take more kind of coordination to overcome. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, the interviews are still ongoing. So if we haven't reached out to your site yet, I hope you'll speak with us when we reach out to set up a time. It's been a really, it's been a very interesting and insightful experience to be able to connect with the imaging leaders across the different sites. Okay, that's it for me. Okay, I think Sterling, you're up next.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sterling Johnson, and it's my pleasure now to talk about some of our forward-going plans, and then we'll have time for questions on Beth's talk and my comments, and we look forward to your feedback. Let me share my screen. All right, hopefully you can all see that. ATN imaging and the ADRCs. Next steps in program-wide collaboration is what I'll be talking about here. So we know we've all got biomarker cores, most of them imaging, and those of you here likely have an imaging core at your center. These are possible aims that you may already have. Facilitate ATN imaging in your clinical core. Develop and deploy standard imaging protocols across your ADRC and the many linked studies to your ADRC. You may be doing intake and QC processes and file management of images and doing standardized analyses across your center and providing ATN categorizations to your researchers and in some cases to participants. You're likely sharing your images and results with NACC and with anybody who's qualified and asks you for your data. You may be sharing that. And of course, you're supporting local innovation, you're supporting your investigators, and that's kind of the justification for why an imaging core would exist. We want to point out right here at the start that SCAN can help with a lot of these things. SCAN will hopefully free up your time to spend more of it doing innovative things and supporting your investigators. But SCAN can do things like share your data, doing the standardized analyses, doing some intake and QC and file management. And it'll be, I think, an important resource, an exciting resource for all of us. And that leaves the first aim here not fully addressed, and that comes with funding. And we know that many of you have included imaging in your P30 funding, but also most of us rely on other linked studies to do this work. As we've been talking with the centers, and as Beth has already mentioned, there's so many scientific strengths and opportunities for innovation that you're undertaking, but we all approach imaging a little bit differently, especially administratively, and the local barriers are usually unique, and you've come up with some creative solutions to those. We've observed kind of three different models, and the first model here is that the R01s are kind of guiding what the imaging protocol would be. The R01s are paying for that protocol, and that data might be shared back with the ADRC. So this is kind of from the ground up driven by the R01s themselves and by the investigators who are thinking up the science. The second model is where the R01s might fund the work, but the imaging protocol is standardized across the center, and And at least there's some commonalities that all the RO1s have across the center. And so that's kind of a second model. And a third model is where the images are paid centrally by center if you have funding to do that, and the protocol is kind of driven by the center itself. And the RO1 will utilize those images that you collect as a center. But really, I think the most common is a blend of B and C, where sometimes the funding is paid by the RO1, sometimes it's paid by the center. And so there's quite a bit of heterogeneity here. You've come up with a lot of unique ways to do this, but these can create logistical problems when it comes to sharing these data. And so here's some of the potential barriers that could occur with these different models. What we would like to do with SCAN going forward is have at least a base of unified and commonly collected sequences for MRI and the PET scans according to the different scan parameters that have been listed on the SCAN website. We think this will hopefully not be too onerous and would be so useful going forward for all of us to collect data together. It's important to point out that SCAN is not synonymous with the supplements that some of the sites have received. SCAN is a resource for all the centers, and it's also something that we kind of want all the centers to participate in. We'd like you to upload your images to SCAN. We'd like you to do at least the T1 weighted and FLAIR image on the MRI side and upload that. And by and large, our PET scans are already within the parameters that SCAN has specified. Today, we want to talk about what the SCAN database will look like in 5 years, and also how can we efficiently increase ATN imaging in the ADRCs to populate this database with what we want to eventually get out of it. So scientific intentionality is the first topic. We want to, of course, have high impact science. We want to avoid confounds. We want to make sure that we have input on what we put into the SCAN database. You can think of SCAN as a passive receiver, more or less, of the images. SCAN will receive whatever we give it, and it's up to us as a group of imaging cores to decide what goes into it. Well, the next major point is how to efficiently increase ATN imaging in the ADRCs. And as Beth pointed out in our site interviews, the major barrier was funding. Needed to scale up radioligand production and ordering and imaging, and the staffing needed to do these things. But throughput was also a barrier, both in terms of radioligand production and ordering, and then throughput at the scanners themselves. And we can't solve all the local constraints that you might have, but we want to hear what your barriers are and see if we can identify some common barriers that we can solve from a central standpoint. And funding is one of those things. So who to scan? Again, thinking of what this database is going to look like in 5 years, we have an opportunity now to think of that now and potentially steer the ship in that direction. So when we did our interviews with the sites, we asked, what do you think the scientific priorities are of the centers that if we collaborated and worked together, that we could accomplish? And I'll show you that list in just a second. The other consideration for who goes into SCAN is really driven by the sites and what your local goals are and your interests, and the RO1s and U19s are that you participate in. So there's still a level of local autonomy and local prioritization that is central to the ADRC system. But perhaps we can do both. Perhaps we can come up with a way of having some national priorities that we work on together that is unobtrusive and still enables the local projects to happen. So here's a little bit of a menu of agreed upon priorities, or at least the start of a list of what could become a menu of agreed upon priorities. And we're thinking of these things in a way that doesn't require a separate U19 protocol or an R01 protocol. Just what are some themes that could be emphasized in the subjects that we upload into SCAN? All of the centers we've talked to so far have stressed that we need to be mindful of generalizability of who's in the SCAN database and ensure that there's diversity. We need to capture the heterogeneity of the diagnoses encountered at the centers and demonstrate the precision and or the limits of ATN imaging to capture ADRD. Enabling blood biomarkers with imaging cross-validation was very commonly mentioned as a scientific need within the ADRC system. And this could easily be addressed by co-enrolling, for example, people in a biomarker initiative like NECRAD has put together, as well as in imaging for SCAN. Another priority that was mentioned several times is to demonstrate the prognostic utility. And you can think of this in terms of a cognitively unimpaired person who's amyloid positive. What is the prognostic utility of ATN imaging in that individual for their eventual cognitive decline? Understanding the signal and the limitations of PET imaging. This is one of our newer techniques, and we need to know more thoroughly than we know now what the neuropath correlation is with the PET signal. We also know that the PET signal from tau imaging is more heterogeneous than amyloid, and we need to capture that spatial complexity in a way and determine if we can apply a centiloid-like equivalent to the tau images. There's rare phenotypes and genotypes in the ADRCs that can be captured with SCAN. There's the potential for wide sharing and the ADRCs joining other national and global initiatives through sharing of the data that we contribute. And of course, going beyond, on the MR side, going beyond the T1 weighted image and the FLAIR scan. These are kind of fundamentals, but there's potentially a lot that could be done with coordinated effort among the centers. Well, so those are some themes that have come out of those interviews. And with regard to addressing the second major point, which is how are we going to get more imaging accomplished in the centers? The NIA has asked for more detailed plans from us, and we've been discussing frameworks for increasing funding to the centers and increasing the ways of getting imaging to happen at the centers. And as was mentioned in Beth's talk, improving radioligand availability is a big one. And so one of the things we are exploring and that we would like to try to formalize is partnerships with the companies who produce these radioligands, such that there could be some centralized contracts so that each site doesn't have to put their own contract together and negotiate all this. And if there was some centrality to that, it might improve efficiency and have a number of other benefits. And also, we've been considering how we could get some funding out to the centers in a quicker way. And the administrative supplements was one way to do that. There may be another way, and that is using NACC as kind of a warehouse and a way station and an administrative center for coordinating some funding and the funds flow to the sites. So indeed, here's some options. One is a U19 or a very large multi-site R01, this is kind of beyond the scope of what we had in mind, because there's plenty of creative individuals among you all who are putting U19s and R01s together, and many of these are multi-site and involve many of the ADRCs, and we want you to have the room to do that. What we are thinking of is more of a multi-center collaborative model that is more of a lighter touch, and by that we mean that may be focused on some of those themes that I mentioned a couple slides ago, things that don't interfere with your local goals, things that don't require a central study protocol, but are ways of populating the SCAN database with certain characteristics and things that allow us to address certain scientific goals. So ATN imaging that satisfies one of these themes may get paid from a central source, and the funds flow would need to be worked out on this, and we're actively discussing these kinds of things, and we need your feedback. The other option would be more of a center-initiated project that might take advantage of this centralized funding. This may be tough to do, to put a compelling project together that has a lot of PET imaging in it, because the scans are so expensive. But it might be feasible to do, especially on the MR side, to do smaller multi-site projects that help us accomplish our goals together. So just thinking of these radioligands, the current model is that an individual center and maybe individual PIs within your center are negotiating with companies, and you're developing agreements with those companies. And that has a lot of inefficiencies, as we mentioned. A central model would be that NACC, or other designated entity, but probably NACC, would do this negotiation with key input from the Imaging Steering Committee, and then the sites could then simply be added to that centralized agreement through a work statement. There's a lot of advantages to doing this kind of thing. One is that you don't have to do the negotiating. There's some simplification of this process that this will enable. This may increase distribution capabilities and even out pricing across the centers and across the country. We think that if the radioligand costs could be paid centrally, you may not even see the bill for that, as that's one scenario. And all of these things are on the table and worth discussing. Other advantages of doing this is that a central contract for radioligand may stretch your budget by allowing you to pay for other things instead of paying for radioligand. Again, saving you time at the site level, and this may facilitate switching of ligands if that fit with your goals, and also help accelerate the validation and integration of new ligands as they become available. So I don't have too many more slides. I wanted to just summarize here that the centers collectively are an ATN imaging powerhouse. As Beth pointed out early on in her slides, we could easily outpace what ADNI has been doing if we had the resources at the centers. ATN imaging has central importance, but it's kind of foundational, and there's a lot of innovation that can happen around this. And this is a time of transition and opportunity. There's a lot of new resources and possibilities that the imaging corps now have. SCAN is an important resource that we have, and we want to make sure we're intentionally populating this database. We really do want you to upload your ADRC participants to SCAN. We'd like you to participate in this, even if you didn't have a supplement. And we know that this is going to be a process, and that that this will likely experience a lot of growth over the next year or so. And finally, there will be an opportunity, we hope, for more resources to augment what you're doing. And this will likely involve centrally administered funds for radioligand and imaging. We can't promise anything, and we don't know how this is going to eventually pan out, but we need your input at this point on whether this would be of use to you and what would work for your center. So that new initiative would include, just to summarize, a partnership between the steering committee and NACC. It would include potential funding to NACC to allocate, to be allocated for imaging and radioligand, centralized agreements for radioligand, and the funding would be potentially administered in a way that allows us to achieve our joint scientific priorities. This shouldn't impede anything that you're doing or detract from your existing arrangements with other radioligand companies or your existing work. This is intended to facilitate and augment what you're doing now and not detract from it. Okay, so those were my comments. We have a couple of questions here we want you to comment on if you can. We're especially interested in hearing from the imaging core leaders and center directors and clinical core leaders on how you think that radioligand and scan cost coverage would help you, and whether you are or what your opinion is on these on this multi-center collaborative idea around themes, like I mentioned on that prior slide. And then any other suggestions you have would be useful to us. So let me stop there and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Sterling. I just wanted again to say my thanks to Beth and Sterling. I think that one piece, that we understand that, more resources are needed, but also, we developed SCAN to standardize and centralize imaging. We've been talking about this process for, the last 4 years, and it's slow going. There's a lot of details, there's a lot of data and a lot of opportunities. But I think we want to give the center network a chance to understand that we would like a catalog of the data. We need NACC to have the capacity to understand what is available at each and every center on a center level that kind of comes together in a collective manner. We want to maximize the data deposition that occurs through imaging, and we want the research community to have access to the images and add to the knowledge base of all the work that you produced. And so we are looking to have the logistics and the feasibility that having a centralized depository can work for the network, and that people are going to deposit their images into the data. And I believe that if we all kind of work together to have SCAN work in the manner that we think that we want it to work, we can then collectively understand the images that we have, the things that challenge us, and how we can work to overcome those challenges, and also have a better idea of the resources that are required in order to make, everything work. We are open to discussing and bringing the ideas forward and looking for ways to collaboratively bring this effort together. And I just want to let you know that, like, we hear your number one request, but we require more details and more evidence that we can logistically make this happen. So with that, type your answers or your questions into the Q&A. This is like a set aside period where you kind of talk to us. So thanks.
We do have there's a couple of questions that have been typed in the Q&A that
Yes.
we can go
Yeah,
through.
the first one is from Judy. She said, Judy Pa, one of the potential conflicts was publications. R01 PIs may want to publish results first. And that could be a perceived threat or barrier to uploading your data to scan in real time. That's a tricky one, and that's tough to know how to answer. I think at the site level, you know your data better than a third party would, and I presume that you'll have that chance to publish your data first. But that's always a trade-off of doing this kind of work, is that we have to also be mindful that the taxpayers fund this and that it's a publicly available resource. What do you think of that, Cerise? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I definitely think that, you know, as a clinical trial is considering uploading the scan, that's a consideration. But, you know, I think there's some logistics and timing in which you deposit your data that could work that aligns to your publication. So I think there's ways to work on that.
Thank you.
The next question is from Gil. So it's a comment from Gil Rabinovich. He says that, you know, R01s, especially multi-site studies, could leverage scan infrastructure and provide some resources to support, but this would require flexibility. They might want to leverage and fund scan for image QC and data sharing, but investigators may prefer to perform image analysis independently. And this would not allocate R01 resources for the functions of scan. Yeah, so that's my assumption is exactly that would be the case. You know, most of the sites have the capability of doing their own data analyses, and the analyses in scan would be kind of parallel efforts to what investigators would be doing locally, but then have the added benefit with the scan analysis that would be harmonized across sites. So then, you know, people can pull that data together. So I don't know, Sterling, do you have any other comments on?
I agree completely. The beauty here is the flexibility that we have. There'll be some harmonized analyses that scan can do, but this won't preclude or prevent others from doing things the way they want to do it. But what we don't have yet is something that ADNI has, for example, where users can contribute their analyses to a central database. You can upload your own spreadsheets to ADNI, for example, as long as they're vetted. That could be something we can consider for scan. Okay, the next question was from Adam. Adam Brickman says, there's a great job on touching on how the structure of imaging differs across the centers. For some centers like ours, where imaging acquisition is not necessarily central through the ADRC, it is hard to harmonize acquisition protocols. And he goes on to say that some designated money, primary money for prospective imaging of the clinical core would be needed for centers in their situation. And that's exactly it. We are going to need some central, some allocated money for clinical core imaging.
A question from Jim Brewer. So one difficulty is that ongoing R01 studies won't want to change their protocols. So this will only ramp up as new studies get started. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that I think in part is why, SCAN, they kind of came up with these 2 tiers. So, a 10-minute tier of, the T1 and flare that, could presumably be added on, in addition to, the protocol that you prefer to do either for legacy reasons or because it's, better quality. So I think that was, like a flexible component to both allow some minimal degree of harmonization and sharing. But you're right. I mean, it is an ask of the centers to include these 10 minutes if it doesn't align with their protocols, and it will be easier for newer studies to integrate this, as you're noting.
Okay, there's a comment from Trey, which is, at some point a uniform data set achieves sufficient power. More important to discover may be the linkage of site unique data to the standardized measures. And this encourages sharing, but suggests that SCAN may be too limited if only particular data types are accepted as compliant. I think this is an important point. The SCAN imaging data right now is kind of the starting point. The flare and the T1, this is going to get us going and get us used to uploading and populating that database. But hopefully this will be something that can be expandable to more unique multi-site imaging efforts. Different modalities as well as different subject characteristics. And we touched on what some of those subject characteristics might be. But we also need to consider that eventually we need to move beyond the T1 weighted and the flare scan to get to do some unique science.
All right, so the next question is from Howie Rosen. So SCAN is currently using the ADNI-3 protocols for MRI. What will happen when ADNI changes? So this is kind of a question for SCAN, and I think this does, this is what happens with MRI protocols. They're getting updated, and the updates, do have implications for harmonization. I don't know if Bill or Cliff want to make a comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the SCAN website, you'll see that the MR protocol isn't there anymore. It was uploaded. We had it there, and then we took it down for this very reason. So actually, Cliff and Brett have just spent the last week or two updating the SCAN MRI protocol to become compliant with where they think the ADNI 4 protocol is going. So we're actually, in fact, sort of changing the SCAN protocol probably before the ADNI protocol will change, and it might yet change again. But the short answer to your question is that SCAN and ADNI will remain harmonized.
Okay, there's a question from Allison Rosen. Let's see. Oh, I know ADNI has a human connectome subproject. Will there be any attempt to harmonize or connect with this? That may be beyond what we're doing right now with SCAN, but that's something we can look into and consider for the future.
Hey, Sterling and Beth, we've got a couple of questions from people who have raised their hands. Would you mind if I allow one of them to talk? Great, I'm gonna call on Charlie. Charlie, you should be able to answer if you turn on your mic.
Thank you. So I just wanted to point out my experience with ADNI a little bit and about this idea of public data. And to say to people who are thinking, how will this affect their R01s? My experience with ADNI has been that it actually tends to enhance use of your data, which makes R01 renewal for competing renewals more likely. Most people use these data in different ways that may not be thought of, whereas you're focused on your R1 and I agree with Cerise that there is this time period in which you will be able to do your analysis, but again, they won't have all of the other things associated with your project. And so in a sense, I see it as a win-win situation. And I just thought I'd make that comment.
Thanks, Charlie.
Great. And then up next, we have a hand raised from John. John, you should be allowed to talk.
Yeah, hi. This is John Schau. So I wanted to follow up on what Charlie just said and with Judy's question and some of the other questions. So as many of you know, I'm the project officer for ADNI, and I think what Cerise and Nina and I and NIA have been thinking about for SCAN and for this whole effort is that it's not going to be like ADNI where you have to upload your data and you really don't have any sort of necessary claim over it. So certainly this whole effort is going to involve a balance between what benefits the field as a whole and what benefits the individuals doing the actual work. So I would suspect that there will be, some limited embargo time. Certainly everybody worries about somebody stealing their data and, scooping them, but in actual fact, that almost never happens. I've never actually seen that happen because it's hard to look at somebody else's data and figure it out. And the other important thing to remember here is we are, or at least I think we are very aware that asking you to change your protocols, your existing protocols, and to do all this work isn't going to be for free. One thing that was made clear to us by all the ADRCs right from the get-go was that, we can't be asking for unfunded mandates. And we are very, very aware of that.
Thanks, John.
Okay, we had a comment from Andy Sakin about data sharing, how this is so important. And his comment was about reciprocity with other imaging and omics groups around the country, or around the world, actually. And yeah, that would be incredible. Nina's got a comment, a response to that, Andy.
So there's a comment.
Burns, go ahead, Beth.
Oh, yeah, a comment from Jeffrey Burns, kind of suggesting a simple model. A simple, efficient model just would be upload fees, so scans in proper format for NACC would, like $600 for MRI, $2,000 for MLIPET, et cetera. Keep it simple, sites then organize their efforts around that, cover extra costs or make it work at that level. Scan as many with limits or as few as appropriate for the site to advance their science. So kind of allowing the sites to, be in charge of the direction while quickly creating a large national ADNI-like data set. Yeah, so like in that model, it would really try to, not implement any additional kind of protocols or be linked to any sort of additional study protocols. It would be just about getting the funds to the cores.
And that is somewhat, that's been a model we've been thinking about, and that might be something that we could consider in this, if we're able to get some additional funding that is managed centrally, there may be something like that we could do.
Oh, we have Marilyn Miller has her hand raised. Actually, I don't know how to activate that. Hannah, can you let Marilyn? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Miller. I'm the program director for genetics of Alzheimer's disease. We have a data harmonization work group that is fully underway. We have already harmonized 5,000 images, maybe more by now, and we're applying machine learning analysis to those data. We would be more than happy to work with you folks. A large number of the subjects in the Alzheimer's disease sequencing project are from the Alzheimer's disease centers. So it would be wonderful if we could bring together the genetic data with the imaging data in any way that we can, so we can leverage both of those major efforts.
That's terrific, and that is potentially the impact of this SCAN initiative and all these uploads, is to participate in these really high impact projects.
Just let me know when you guys are ready, and we'll start a conversation.
We're ready.
Okay, I'm gonna have an email between you and Mike Kukro and Tim Homan. And who do you want on the email?
You can follow with Bill, Marilyn. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you.
We have a comment from Ron Kiliani. How does this drive? Okay, yeah, so this is a question about innovation. So larger data sets of data acquired with common methodology is a great goal, and I strongly support it, but how does this drive innovation? Yeah, are T1 and FLAIR expected to provide the answers we are looking for? Yeah, I mean, I think this is an excellent point, especially with like an undirected kind of model. That's the risk, is, you know, what will come of this if we just rapidly collect this type of data.
Yeah, it's kind of up to us as a group of centers to drive that, and starting with the T1 and FLAIR is just that. It's where we're going to start, get everyone familiar with uploading, and there's a lot that can be done with that T1 weighted scan, of course, and the FLAIR, but there's more to it, and we're mindful of that.
And Sterling, there was one more question that came in through the chat from the Quan Q. Will it be possible to have centralized IND to cover ligands? Having IND at each institution is quite a barrier.
Yeah, it's a great question. It is a barrier, all the regulatory work that goes with doing experimental imaging, where you're injecting a radio tracer that is not FDA approved. If your site is one that orders ligand, your IND can be fairly straightforward, and most of it would be template based. And we would try to provide support for that by having some of that template information, sample text available to you. And the companies that we've talked with so far have agreed to do that and to make their INDs available for you to cross-reference and tag onto.
Scott PTRL put a comment in the chat about, will SCAN use ADNI3 basic or advanced parameters or both, or accept anything that is at least ADNI3 basic? And the SCAN team are next on the agenda, and they'll cover that for you, Scott, if you stick around.
Sterling Beth, John has raised his hand. Is it okay to allow him to speak now?
Sure. Let me just address, there's two quick comments. So Cliff, is pointing out that there are more options than just the T1 and FLAIR for scan. And then another comment from Judy about the scan protocol. So just to clarify, yeah, the scan protocol is, there's MRI sequences, but yeah, also amyloid and tau PET are also included in this, and all these protocols are listed, on the scan website. And we'll hear more about that at the end of the session as well.
This is John Chow again. Innovation is incredibly important. And so one of the other things that we are very, very aware of is that this effort should not decrease innovation. This is not going to replace anything that you're doing already. And that how we've always thought of this is that this is taking advantage of all the NAPA money and really adding more hopefully adding more resources for you guys to be able to do more research, but having the research be something that can be combined. And there's huge value in large numbers, and that's a big part of the purpose behind this. But absolutely, we do not want to stifle innovation in any way.
Thanks, John.
A comment from Andy Sakin. How can we expand the alphabet beyond AT, regarding innovation beyond ATN, beginning with smaller groups of centers that may want to collaborate on novel molecular targets? This could be via RL1s are used, but perhaps it could also be via scan. John Detry is commenting too on the T1 and FLAIR question. So they don't take long to acquire, but if that's sufficient to obtain cost support, then they could potentially cover the cost of additional sequences by using by contributing to scan. And this could allow for comparison of standard ADNI T1 to high resolution or multi-echo acquisitions, or rapidly acquire acquire data on novel MRI strategies.
Yeah, I think that's the idea here, is that by paying for these fundamentals, the ATN ABCs are the basic alphabet building blocks that frees you up to add on other experimental measures and increase innovation. So we're hoping that this will be standardized and to some degree less innovative as what we do together, but it will free up resources to innovate, and it will cover the fundamentals, which is something we're not necessarily doing adequately now in our clinical cores. We don't necessarily know who in our clinical cores have amyloid and have tau. And that's what this is addressing. And I think it's important to not lose sight of that. Innovation can and should and will continue to happen on top of all of this, including radioligands, to address Sanjay's question.
Okay, I think we need, here's a comment from Sam Lockhart. If the site makes its own tracer, when any of the potential funds help cover local radio tracer production for scan compliant data? Yeah, I think absolutely that's what we would want. We would want it to be consistent with what the sites, their local procedures are, whether that's local production or purchasing ligands. Okay, we should probably move on.
Yes, if you think of other questions or comments, we'll have these slides, and the listservs for the imaging core leaders, as well as the steering committee, is there, and feel free to drop us a line.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for this discussion. Okay, so we're going to move on. We have 2 Blitz style talks to hear about, some example studies with recently funded supplements. These are just 5-minute talks each. And so first we're going to be hearing from Annie Cohen from Pittsburgh on their supplement.
Everybody can see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I'm really pleased that we were invited to talk about our scan supplement that was funded over the summer. I wish I had more data to show everyone, but like everyone else, we have really just resumed our imaging after about an almost year hiatus. So the aims of our scan supplement were to acquire tau PET imaging on about 90 eligible new PIT ADRC participants. And the background that I should give you of our center is that we've been using donation funds to collect both PIB and fluortaucipir PET on all of our eligible ADRC participants. So this includes people with an MMSE over 17. So we don't image anybody who is severely demented, and we can't, because of local regulations, do PET imaging on anyone who also can't have an MRI. So what our proposal was for the scan supplement was to do a head-to-head comparison in 90 of our ADRC participants who are also getting PIB PET and fluortaucipir PET. We also have proposed under our new P30 to collect GTP1 tau PET imaging. And so our overall plan is to do head-to-head comparisons of these three tracers. And our goal with this is to utilizing the Z-score method that was proposed by Prashanthi Vimuri in 2017 to capture sort of an overall tau deposition and standardized cross tracer measures like Centiloid using something like the Centaur that Victor Villamagne proposed. So as I mentioned, we haven't been able to do a lot with this supplement because we really just in the last month have resumed our PET and MR imaging operations. We've collected 2 participants so far from this ADRC study, but we were also very lucky that Victor Villamagne joined our faculty in August 2020, and he's become very active in this head-to-head tau PET project with me. And he also has plans to integrate a new tracer of astrogliosis into our current tracer library. And so we're hopeful that we can add that into this PET imaging that we're doing, perhaps with an R01 that utilizes our ADRC participants. We also, during this time, were able to publish our first head-to-head MK6240 fluortaucipir comparisons that were collected in our ADRC participants, but were funded through our current program project grant. And just very quickly, what we identified were that overall there was good agreement with visual read positivity with these tracers. There were differences in our off-target binding, with fluortaucipir showing higher striatal and choroid plexus off-target binding, with MK6240 showing increased meninges binding, and that MK6240 in our comparisons had about twice the dynamic range as fluortaucipir did. And so that really was just the beginning of these comparisons that we hope to do and expand and add GTP1 to. So also through these efforts, while we've been down and not able to scan for this supplement, we've been working with Victor and Dana Tudorascu in our statistics core to develop these strategies for this Centiloid-like approach. And we've also established a working group to start applying this ATN classification to all of these ADRC participants that we are beginning to collect PET and MRI imaging. And you can see that this is a fantastic group of people, and we actually just published a review in the Journal of Nuclear Medicine discussing sort of strategies and challenges for determining tau positivity. And that is my 5 minutes. So I'll just thank all of you for listening, and a special thank you to our participants and their families who are super willing to go through lots of PET imaging and spend lots of time at our center with us. And of course, all of the collaborators on our team who are doing all the hard work.
Thank you, Annie. It's great.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, a really exciting study. Okay, next we have Brian Gold from University of Kentucky.
All right, good morning, everybody. Can you see my screen okay? I'm gonna go to presentation mode.
Yeah. Oh, it's in your, yeah, that looks good.
You see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Can you hear me okay, Beth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me to talk. I want to update you a little bit on our supplement at the University of Kentucky. And as we're in a similar boat as Annie, of course, and most other centers are with respect to delays related to COVID. But having said that, I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be focusing on. So we're going to be looking at AD mimics. And we're really a center that has expertise in AD mimics at the pathological level. My colleague, Dr. Pete Nelson, leads our neuropath core and has done really, really nice work leading these multi-center studies focusing on AD mimics. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about two of them, limbic predominant TDP encephalopathy or late, and age-related tauopathy or part. So one of the issues we have in terms of trying to understand these mimics is that they co-occur with AD pathology in most cases and at the neuropathological level. And the other issue is that, you know, there's a predilection for the same regions of the brain in terms of, you know, TDP43 and AD. So having said that, though, there's a huge upside to developing imaging markers to really understand these mimics, both in terms of identifying them early, but also on top of that, in terms of sharpening our existing understanding of our AD biomarkers. So, you know, most previous studies that have been done to date have been retrospective. So they've really classified their MRIs going back after the autopsy was done. And going back to what I was mentioning before, there really is this overlap where, you know, we see hippocampal neuroimaging atrophy in those with TDP43, as well as AD, although sometimes these effects are greater in TDP43 pathology. So more recently, there's been some work looking at, you know, regions outside the MTL, like frontal cortex, and TDP43 pathology has been found to be, show greater atrophy in some of these more recent studies. So my great colleague who leads our clinical core, Dr. Greg Jagust, is helping us to recruit, leading the efforts to recruit for this study. And he made this really wonderful schematic. And so what we're going to be focusing on is recruiting people who basically we already have CSF, MRI, and clinical data on. So we'll really be focusing on individuals who are amyloid negative to maximize the chance that we can image folks who are not Alzheimer's, at least not pure Alzheimer's. And then we'll have some exclusionary criteria. TDP43 is common in FTD and dementia of the Lewy body type. So they'll be excluded clinically. And then because we have the MRIs, we're going to be able to exclude for cerebrovascular damage on flares. So what this is going to allow us to do is basically we're going to have 3 subgroups. One is going to be pure controls using the ATN method, sort of schematic. One will be age-related tauopathy, and one will be late. So, and with this, we will do our analyses, and just these are our 2 aims. So we're going to identify patterns that are characteristic of late and part, and use machine learning methods to identify and differentiate those from normals as well as those with AD. And then, of course, the sharing aim is to upload our data combined with our deeply phenotyped data on genetics and clinical information to allow for greater collaborations across ADRCs. So this is our battery. We're primarily focusing on MRI, although we do PET as well. So these are the sequences that are SCAN and ADNI, exactly those sequences. We have some other sequences that are very similar to the ADNI sequences, but they're tweaked a little bit in terms of interests we have, such as doing quantitative iron imaging and some more unbiased kinds of cerebral perfusion. And our scanning happens on our research dedicated 3T scanner. So our analyses, we're going to be doing multimodal imaging, as I mentioned, and we want to look at standard things like volume, as well as white matter microstructure and perfusion. I mentioned we want to identify using ROC curves and machine learning, try to identify more pure kinds of AD mimics. What we're going to be looking for, really, the challenge is to try to identify patterns, of course, that are linked with cognitive dysfunction, but not amyloid load. So just to give you a sense of what we're thinking about with respect to this, and this is older data, but it's the issue we have to think about, is that, how do we do that? So, for example, in some of our previous work, I'm showing an example here of, two groups. One is at low risk for AD, one is at higher risk. And we see white matter microstructural differences, such that we see an effect in the fornix for the high risk group, even though these groups are cognitively normal. So then, since the fornix, of course, is a hippocampal tract, if we control for hippocampal volume, we still have that effect. When we look at our actual scatter plot, we see that there is a nice relationship between having an AD CSF profile and FA, or fractional anisotropy, in the fornix. But what we see, interestingly, is that there's this group of individuals who show, a non-AD signature profile in CSF, and yet they still have lower FA in the fornix. So this is the kind of things we need to think about in our analyses is, are we going to compare regions like hippocampus and fornix and try to see if the effect is stronger in one group versus the other? That's one kind of analysis we can think about doing to try to separate groups. Another one is more voxel-wise types of techniques, where we can try to look at, if pathologies are more associated with spatially distinct regions of change in a specific structure like the fornix, or even whole brain type analyses. So for example, here we see that there's a right lateralized effect that was specific to a pattern of p-tau over A beta 42. So using our inclusion criteria, can we see group effects that may be different, in TDP 43 or apart compared to controls? And we've been developing templates for DTI that we think are a little bit more suitable for older adults, because they include older adults in their development. And so these are the kind of analyses we're thinking of doing, and then running machine learning algorithms and so on. And so just to close up, the second aim is ongoing, of course, as well. And we have, so far, to update you, we've scanned 8 subjects who fit our inclusion criteria. This, of course, would be much higher if it wasn't for COVID, and we are moving forward rapidly now. And we have uploaded our Phantom to Mayo, and we are ready to upload to Loney. This is just a little schematic that shows, of course, we're going to be doing our own analyses as in aim 1. And for aim 2, we're going to be uploading to SCAN, and this will be shared with other consortia. And as I mentioned, this will, we hope, help collaborate across ADRCs to get more data on these AD mimics and learn more about them and sharpen our AD markers as well. I just want to thank my colleagues at the ADRC, as well as lab members, and the supplement that we did receive. And thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you, Brian. It's an excellent example of this, exciting heterogeneity too within the program. Thank you. Okay, so we're perfectly on time. So this next session, we have 30 minutes to hear a few SCAN presentations, and then we also have 15 more minutes for questions for the SCAN team as well. So the first talk is going to be from Bill Jagust.
Hi, I'm going to try to go through a very general overview of SCAN in a couple of minutes. Cliff, Jack, and I are both PIs of this study, and as I think you've all been hearing, the goal of SCAN is to standardize acquisition and analysis of PET and MRI data and create a large database that's available to everybody. Let's see. So these are the players in SCAN, the main players, and we're doing data analysis for PET in Berkeley, QC for PET in Michigan, protocol management and QC for MRI at Mayo, and MRI analysis at UC Davis. So this is the really the core of SCAN, and I really want to spend a moment on it. Basically, I want to show you what a SCAN compliant image is. And it's basically a scan that's acquired at the ADRCs on a NACC participant on a scanner that's been approved, either an MR or a PET scanner that's been approved by SCAN. The data will be publicly available, and it's prospectively acquired after the beginning of this calendar year. If the answer of any of these questions is no, that is, it's not a NACC it's not a approved scanner, for example, we'll work with you to get your scanner approved. So this really isn't shouldn't be a real stopping point. So this is an acceptable scan, and it doesn't matter what the source of funding is. Any scan that meets these criteria, regardless of whether it was funded from a supplement, an R01, another multi-center grant, these are acceptable for upload. And so these would be uploaded to Loney. The approved sequences would be analyzed in a lab. The approved QC'd images will be curated and available for download, and the numerical data will be re-uploaded to NACC and linked to the participant ID. If by chance there are data uploaded that aren't approved, these will be quarantined. Now, just want to spend one moment on this legacy data that's been previously uploaded to NACC. This is a very large potential resource, and we're discussing ways that we might be able to access some of this and analyze some of it, especially for PET, which is it tends to be more harmonized. So this is, hopefully this will answer all your questions. If you can't, if you need to look at this again, this is taken directly from the SCAN websites. So here's the SCAN website. So this is what we've accomplished to date. We've got all the image acquisition protocols for MRI and PET. There are the MRI technical manual, as I mentioned, has been taken down but it's ready to go right back up because it's been altered slightly to harmonize with what we think are going to be the ADNI 4 protocols. And there might yet be some changes in it, but the manual should be on the website again very soon. Everything is on the website, which you can see here: the manuals, the protocols, the forms, and so forth can be downloaded from the SCAN website. The Loney portal is up for SCAN data upload. We're ready to go. And all of the image standardization and QC are in place. We have to develop still some additional analysis pipelines. We're talking about how to get results back to the Alzheimer centers, and a lot of the data curation and search functions aren't ready yet, but we don't have any data to curate or search. So just to, again, an overview, the data are going to go from the Alzheimer centers to Loney and NACC. We're trying to make the interface between Loney and NACC as simple as we can. Results will come back to the centers, and then the data are going to be processed, as I've already indicated. And this is the end result. We hope there's going to be a large database with thousands of scans of amyloid, tau, all of the MR readouts that are really relatively commonly used in ADNI, and those will be in numerical databases, and also the images themselves will be available for download. And of course, it's all going to be linked via the ID to the other data available on NACC for ADRC participants. So that's the big picture for SCAN. I guess we're going to take questions after we all do our presentations. I think now what's going to happen is that Suzanne Baker and Brett Borowski are going to get into some of the details about how the image uploads are going to work.
Yeah, that's right. Suzanne, I think you're first. Suzanne Baker from UC Berkeley.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen. Okay, is everyone seeing this okay?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so as Bill mentioned, I'm part of the SCAN team. I'm working closely with Bob Kepi in terms of getting sites QC'd, the PET scanners QC'd, and I'm also working with the Jagust lab. Hold on, I'm having problems. I can't seem to progress my slides. Here we go. Sorry about that. So really quickly, I realize that this is a really busy slide, but if you can just look at your site, here I've listed the PET scanners that we've QC'd. And so if you're not on this list or a specific PET scanner at your site isn't on this list and you intend to use it, please contact me. And also, if for some reason we have an incorrect PET scanner listed, please contact me. I'm going to have this information in the upper right on every slide, since I think it's probably the most important information I can convey to you today. In terms of qualifying your PET scanner, if you haven't done this already, you're going to need to get a Hoffman Phantom. If you don't have one, you can get in touch with me and we can get one shipped to you. You will scan and reconstruct the Hoffman according to procedures in the PET manual. And then you want to install the IDA uploader, which is how you're going to upload your data to LONI/NACC. And information on how to do that is in the PET manual. And then there is specific information for how to upload a Hoffman Phantom as opposed to just regular PET data. And that's also in the manual. And so you want to make sure that you go to the Hoffman specific upload instructions in Appendix E, and then you'll await feedback from either Bob Kepi or myself in terms of whether or not your scan has passed QC. In terms of acquiring PET data, first you want to check the manual to make sure that you have the acquisition times and the PET tracer that we're allowing for. Go through and do your regular PET data acquisition, but there's also this 2-page form that you can have your PET tech fill out or your study coordinator fill out during the acquisition. And then when you go to upload the data, you're going to want to transfer information from the PET upload form into the PET meta form that's going to be part of the LONI upload. So just to go over this a little bit, you want to upload the PET data, you open your IDA uploader, which hopefully you've already installed. You just log in with your email and password. You're going to choose SCAN as your site. And again, all this information is in the manual in case you're not as familiar with it right now. And then you'll enter your ADRC subject ID, choose the files to upload and click upload. And so you're going to see the screen that says complete upload. And then you see this next screen where there's actually a web address, and you're going to need to go to that web address to then go to the metadata. And so you're going to see a screen that looks like this. Down here under PET images, you see this complete form. So you need to click on that complete form. And then this again is numbered now so that it matches the information on the PET upload forms that I showed you on the previous slide. And so you want to fill out the information here, click update, and then you're going to see this finish upload after you've filled out that PET form. So you want to make sure you get to that finish upload and not stop just with the images. And then you can download a CSV file showing what your upload was for the day. And that's essentially it. So just really quickly, this is just the table of scans that we would accept, but this is also available in the PET manual. And don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions regarding any of this. Thank you.
Hey, Suzanne. Okay, next we get a demo from Brett Borowski from Mayo on the MRI side.
Are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yeah.
See my screen? Perfect.
Yeah, the screen, it's not in presenter mode. I don't know if that matters too much. There we go.
There we go.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So I've had the luxury of meeting most of you through ADME or other studies, but for those that I haven't, my name is Brett Borowski, and I work in the ADIR lab at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, under Dr. Jack. And so have a lot of experience with the ADME aspect of imaging, and it seems like SCAN and ADME are going to be quite similar. So I feel like we should have a good grasp on how things will work for SCAN. Just a few things for MRI contact information. So that is our distribution list there, scanmri@mayo.edu. And so you can send any questions on MRI qualification, QC, or acquisitions to us. And then the upload inquiries will go to Loney. So I know that most of your sites have already worked with Loney in the past, and the upload procedure for the MRI images is basically the same as what it is for ADNI. So I'm not going to go into that into much detail, but there are a few things that we've done and are doing just to get the scan initiative up and running. So we've surveyed the MRI sites, created and as Dr. Jagust mentioned, updated the scan MRI manual. And so that was just complete last night. So I did send that to every PI that I had the information for. If you did not receive the manual, you can should be able to get it off the website soon, or you can contact us if you need it prior to that. But in addition to the manual, we will create scan MRI protocols for each MRI supported system. And as you've heard throughout the presentations, the scan protocol is going to be the proposed ADNI 4 protocol. So it is updated from what your sites have been doing from ADNI 3. And the sagittal T1 and the flare sequences are not changing, at least not currently. So if you are doing the option 1 approach, which we will talk about in just a second, those sequences are already on your systems ready to go. And just the last thing there is, so we'll work with your primary contacts with your MRI centers and get their systems, the new protocols loaded and certified the systems for scan. And really getting into the nitty gritty of the MRI protocol here. And this is a busy slide, but I did want to walk through it quickly. So in the emails that I sent last night, and as you've probably heard throughout the presentations today, there's kind of a 2 option or a 2+ option approach to doing the MRI imaging. And so option 1 is the minimal option, where sites will just acquire it and the sagittal 3D flare. And again, those sequences, if you are in ADNI or a related study, they're already on your systems. Option 2, which would be the full scan protocol, and again, this is the proposed ADNI 4 protocol, would contain both the T1 and flares, again, unchanged. And then we have added a T2 space, which is a new sequence for us. Then an axial 3D multi-echo T2 GRE. So again, this is a new echo that can be used for QSM, or sorry, a new sequence that can be used for QSM. Or if your systems aren't ready for that, we can still do the axial T2 star. We have 2 DTI sequences that will be in the protocol. One is the standard longer DTI, and then one is a phase encoding flip DTI, which can be used in post-processing. That just adds just under a minute to the protocol. We have the axial functional MRI, and again, those 3 are all multi-band if the systems are able to run that. And then we will only be doing 3D ASLs, so either the PCASL or PASL sequences at your system, and then the high-res hippocampus scan. And so just to get into the inertia a little bit of how a site might do their scanning. So again, you would be expected to do the first 2 sequences, the T1 and the flare. Then your site could do any other sequences of your choosing. And then lastly, you could choose option 2, which is the full ADNI 4 protocol, the proposed ADNI 4 protocol, or you could do a mix of them. So you could do option 1, choose a couple out of option 2, then the rest of yours. So I think you know, we feel like this should hopefully be able to hit every need for your sites. But we are aware that, you know, this is going to be a little bit confusing, and we want to make sure that, you know, we are doing quality control on the correct sequences. And so we are going to build in some fail safes into the protocol, specifically maybe putting things in the series descriptions so that we can identify which sequences are, you know, going to be scan compliant, and just kind of working with your site so that we know, hopefully beforehand, what your protocol might look like, so that we can proactively make sure that we're selecting the right scans, getting them released for use for outside users, and just working in general to make sure that we can salvage as much as your data as possible that you hope to submit. So again, this is a work in progress, and we are happy to work with your sites to get any version of this that you want up and running. So again, I had sent this in an email last night, but if you do have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to us. We can try to address those as soon as possible and answer any questions you might have. I think just a brief touch on what an MRI certification would look like for scan. So if your site is already involved in ADNI, or that scanner is already involved, you could perform option 1, 2, or a mix of them on just an MRI phantom. If it's a new site or a new scanner at your site, we would have you perform whatever options you are doing, but on a volunteer, so that we can make sure that before an actual participant would come in, that the data is of acceptable quality, and we don't have to bring back any actual subjects for rescans due to a technical issue or some other unforeseen issue. That's more or less it. I didn't want to get too much into the details. We can certainly work with your sites if they have further questions, but again, thank you all for allowing us to be part of the SCAN initiative, and we look forward to working with you and our future successes together. I don't know if we just want to wait for questions later, but I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, so now we have a little over 10 minutes for any questions directed at the SCAN team. So there's looks like one comment in the Q&A. Where can we find the full details? This is from Lisa Silbert for the new ADNI-4 scan protocol.
Yeah, so they have just been finalized. They're still kind of hot off the press, but we can provide further details on the acquisition parameters. But as we typically like to do with sites, we prefer that we send electronic protocols so that they can just be imported into the systems. But we have discussed, we will post the PDFs of these protocols on the SCAN website as well. We are still, I still have a couple more versions of the protocol that needs to be built before we would be ready to send it out to all sites, but we are certainly getting close to being able to distribute those to everyone.
I'll just throw in that we really are trying to make the website the central place for resources for everything. That'll be the descriptions of the sequences, the PDFs of the sequences. You'll have to interact with the labs to get the electronic versions of the sequences, but we're trying to put everything on the website.
I see a question from Dr. Brickman there about non-scan conforming images. So I think Dr. Brickman and everyone, we want those scans uploaded, the sequences uploaded. That being said, in our QC, we will, determine if it was a scan conforming sequence, and those would be the first images to be released. I think it's still to be determined, what happens to the non-scan conforming images, but I think that we would prefer to have them rather than not, if you're willing to send them. If that makes sense. And then we could potentially, release those later if you're willing to allow that.
Yeah, the non-scan compliant images will be quarantined at this point. We're not sure what we're going to do with them, to be honest with you, but it's fine if you upload them. There's a question about, so the idea was that in fact, if the ADRC program is paying for the sequence, then we would want the scan sequences to be done first. So if that, for example, is the T1 and FLAIR, then those would be done first. Those would be the ones that would be prioritized for uploading. And then if you wanted to add on other site-specific sequences after those first, that would be your call.
Yeah, I see a question from John Dietre there. At the last meeting, scan compliant MRI also included ADNI T1 and FLAIR being acquired first during the image protocol. I think that's I think that's ideal if they are acquired first. That being said, if it's not feasible, that's fine. We can certainly pluck those out of the protocol and mark them as scan compliant. But I think typically we like to put the most important sequences at the front of the scanning session. So ideally those are the two of those. A question from Dr. Kiliani about multiple scanners. So yeah, this has been a discussion, and we feel like that, yes, if sites wish to certify multiple scanners, that's certainly acceptable. We understand that it's not feasible to get all your studies done on one system. So we can work with you to certify multiple scanners, and again, multiple versions of the protocol. If on one system you're doing option 1, another system option 2, or a version of either one, I think again it's going to be a little bit of work to get this figured out at sites, but yeah, we certainly do not want to limit you by only saying that one system is available.
I think we have a hand up. Hannah, can you let Robert Reisman ask a question?
Robert should be able to talk now.
Maybe it was an accident. Robert, did you have a comment? Maybe not. Okay.
No, sorry, just an accident. Apologize, guys.
Sure. I did see a question from Dr. Rosen about the ADNI 3 protocols. So yes, the ADNI 3 T1 and FLAIR will still be compliant. The actual scan option 2 protocol is moving towards ADNI 4. So those other sequences will be phased out, I believe, and replaced with the updated ADNI 4 sequences. Yeah, I'm just trying to, I go through them. It seems like we have hit other ones. If anybody has any other questions, if you want to resubmit it or raise your hand, happy to answer those now.
It looks like there's a comment from Emily in the Q&A.
Yeah. So Emily, that's an interesting question. We are going to first of all track the scan uploads by sites. So your site, I mean, one of the excuse me, actually, I'm glad you asked this question because it gives me an opportunity to point out one of the unusual features of scan, which is that there's no requirement for X number of scans from your site, right? So there's really no way for us to know if you've met your own goals for what's going to be uploaded. So what we're going to be doing is providing each ADRC with a list of the scans that have been uploaded. And so you can check that against what you think has been uploaded. So the first question is simply, have your scans been entered into the database? So you will have a record of that. We actually haven't talked about the issues of tracking the use of scans in publications. It's an interesting question. I guess we'll have to talk about that. We really haven't discussed it, but it's a great idea. I agree if we can do that. There's no, at the current time, we actually haven't developed a policy for publication, and my sense is if there is one, it's going to be pretty minimal. In other words, this is going to be kind of ADNI-like. Yeah. So this is, oh, go ahead, Suzanne, if you want to answer this question from John Detry.
Yeah, so he asked, can someone comment on scan PET upload form? It has details on that are not available for retrospective data and are perhaps not routinely recorded in practice. This may limit the ability to upload retrospective PET data. I think that like if you've collected data in the last 4 months and you don't have all of this information, that's fine. When you go to the actual upload for the metadata, there's some fields that we require and others that we would just really like to have. And so if for whatever reason you don't have some of these fields that we require, I guess just get in touch with me and we can try to figure out if we're willing to take the data without, like, if you can't give us the injected dose or whatever you might be concerned about. But hopefully only, I don't know how many scans that have been acquired in the last 5 months, but hopefully moving forward, the PET techs and the study coordinators can have this form in front of them and just do the best they can to complete it. Does that answer your question, John?
All right. There's no more comments. I think we can end there. I like to, yeah, John said that did answer. Somebody just removed it. You did answer his question. Yeah, so I'd like to thank everybody for joining the meeting. I mean, really, if there are additional comments, you feel free to reach out to us in the steering committee to scan directly. We also have the Slack channel. So we really want feedback on these concepts. I'd like to thank the speakers for sharing with us their science, and I'd like to thank the SCAN team for walking us through these steps and for providing a valuable resource for us.